Colombia holds the title of being one of the most mega-diverse countries. When we evaluate the richness in biological diversity that the Colombian territory has, if we look at it by area unit, let's say by species, Brazil is the first country in the world in biological diversity. But when we look at it by area unit, by territory, we have the greatest amount of species with respect to the area of the Colombian territory. In that order of ideas, all citizens according to the constitutional norms have some rights and some obligations, and one of the things is to safeguard or protect that biological diversity. In that order of ideas, there has been a very big problem in the territory due to the introduction of a number of species that have been generating significant impacts to the ecosystemic stability, and have even put in danger of extinction other important species. Many of them we still do not know, and we do not know what their potential is in biotechnology, medicine and other branches of science. Although Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, we also have some problems about native species. What are invasive species? In order to understand what an invasive species is, first we have to understand the main difference between native species, and the main ecological characteristic highlighted by the invaders is the dispersal capacity. These species alone are not capable of reaching the territories where they have established themselves, which differentiates them from the natives because their dispersal capacity has allowed them to colonize those regions. Although native species are species that have had all their speciation processes within the national territory, there are others that are not, which are called exotic species. Many of these exotic species become a problem due to their connotation in competition with other species. That is to say, with native wild species, they become a problem, as is the case, for example, with trout. The trout arrived not accidentally, but was introduced into the national territory as a commercial exploitation. But it got out of control, flooded many parts of streams, lakes of our country, killing many species, as in the case of the savanna of Bogota where they extinguished a species of bird. Why? Because the trout consumed its food source, which was a small fish, a loop. So that is a clear example of a species that was introduced in a non-Western way, but really knowing what it could do, and so it got out of control. Another case could be the pigeons, which being a species that was brought domestic because of its attractiveness and somehow because it had a domestic use, it has also gotten out of control, since the populations at a natural level are not controlled and directly affect wildlife. Why? Because they compete with it for the resource in a direct way. So, in this order of ideas, it is important to get to know what is our responsibility as human beings on this planet Earth, and how with daily actions we can help to prevent many exotic or introduced species from becoming a problem or a very serious competition for our native species. This is the case of the African snail, whose scientific name is Achatina publica, a species that is not known precisely how it has been distributed, because despite being a gastropod or a kind of slug or snail, its displacement is very slow and has colonized much of the country. One of the theories is precisely that the responsibility is very much associated to human action, because humans see it very nice and they are taking it to have it at home in aquariums. But that animal reproduces and becomes a problem. Then they make an inadequate disposal of the animal. Because what they did was to put them in a garbage bag, or they went to a creek and released them into the creek, and the human being was the one who helped the dispersion of an animal, an animal that has a very aggressive reproductive strategy, because every 25 or 30 days the animal can lay around 250 eggs. It reaches reproductive maturity after 3 months and can reproduce in a very advanced volume. Another case is, for example, the entry into the territory of hedgehogs, gerbils and ferrets that somehow bring them to serve as pets. People, when they get bored of them, then try to return them to their natural environment. But if the natural environment is not theirs, then that is where the imbalance takes place. Why? Because they are species that come from other seasonal cycles, that is to say, from seasonal countries where they have very stable breeding seasons. Here, because of the climate, they would not be breeding all year round. The beds are more abundant and can somehow compete with wild species. So they are creating an imbalance. So it is not desirable to do this type of practices. People who have animals and want to somehow get rid of them, because they no longer want them, should somehow try to communicate with the environmental authority to make a final disposition of the individual, either to be sacrificed or to go to a place where they can be kept, such as a zoo, for example. So in this order of ideas, one of the advices of what we do is the responsibility not to help to propagate this type of species, that if you come across one of these animals you can make a disposal, or you can call the environmental authorities so that they can give you the advice or recommendations on how to do it. Something very basic is to open a hole, for example in the garden of your houses or in the lots, and what they do is to place a layer of cal viva at the bottom, let's say at 80 centimeters, deposit the snails there, then place another layer of cal viva and cover them to prevent the animal from getting out again. The animal sometimes eats everything. The excrement of the pets, of the companion animals, the waste we leave, even up to the excrement of the snails, the waste we leave behind, even from construction, because it needs a lot of calcium carbonate to form and/or strengthen its shell. So it is inadequate management, and that is why the responsibility is to have a very good environmental management of the waste. And also with some species it is important to take into account the food supply that we are giving to many species. In ecosystems, food is a limiting factor for the size of populations, and sometimes we believe that by supplying subsidized food we are doing very well with the animals. But we are making them lazy. Some of them obese, and we are favoring their reproductive success, because that animal as such reproduced once or twice a year, according to the supply generated by the ecosystem. Because the ecosystem is the one that regulates the carrying capacity and the success. Let's say how many animals it can support, but if I am subsidizing food, what I am telling it is to reproduce, because I am supplying it with enough food. Then we have to be very responsible precisely with the ecosystem, especially to be able to safeguard that great biological diversity that we have and that we have in the Colombian territory. In this case, we have for example the hippopotamus. This species did not arrive by its own means. It did not arrive to South America, it did not arrive to Colombia, it was brought mainly by the human being. That is the other characteristic that makes it an invasive species, that has been introduced to Colombia or to the territories. In this case in Colombia it was introduced by human beings. You know more or less the whole story during the 80s and the situation that happened at that time. With the Hacienda Napoles, after the arrival of the hippopotamus, since it was not properly managed for a while, the hippos that were in those territories or in this territory of the Hacienda Napoles in that ecosystem as such began to reproduce, and that generated that many individuals went out to look for new territories. Since it is a dominant male that is in the group and many individuals try to look for new territories, many individuals went out as far as the Magdalena River. They even went as far north as Portobarrio, Yondo. What happens there? Well, that starts to turn it into an invasive species, because it no longer has confined restrictions as we see in this case, but it already has a freedom of movement, colonizing different areas in the river, marshes. What makes it a bit invasive? That it starts to reproduce, to generate as other reproductive groups and can enter to compete with native species, even to displace and what such large species imply in the ecosystems, the marshes, can also produce unification processes in the marshes. Well, all this dynamics that species generate in their natural ecosystems. And for example, in Africa they have no problems. But here, there has never been a species like this, so it can cause problems in the ecosystems. There is an important thing that is complex and is what to do with the invaders. Because they are also individuals, the life of the individuals or of the hippopotamuses should also be prioritized. They are not to blame for having arrived in Colombia and being in these circumstances, so it becomes a complex dynamic of what can be done. They can be confined. They can be managed in different ways. But obviously this requires certain resources and there are not always enough resources to manage this species. Ideally, it would be to remove, not to allow individuals to reach the Magdalena, to manage them or transfer them to centers such as the conservation park, management centers where the individuals are confined. But it is problematic. It is difficult to manage this situation. Although we could consider pigeons as invasive species, people do not consider them as such. Pigeons have problems. First, in public health. Secondly, they compete with wild species. And thirdly, they have gotten out of control. Their control is very complicated and costly. In Barcelona, a control was made by the authorities, where they are being hunted, captured and sacrificed, because the problem is big. That is, pigeons usually produce some diseases to human beings. They also produce their excrement, which is highly corrosive and damages buildings. So look that we are also somehow avoiding the destruction of a cultural heritage. There is an important problem, an important issue that is coming up with the hippopotamus, and it is the interaction with other species and in this case also with humans. It is one of the most aggressive species in Africa and has caused deaths to humans. And that can be generated in the territories where these individuals are colonizing. They all have that cuddly effect because they look very pretty. But it is a territorial, aggressive species. It can have problems with the interaction at a negative level. Because with people we know of cases that have killed cattle in the Magdalena Medio and also at an ecosystemic level. It can also bring important problems. Because in terms of conservation there can be displacement of other species. It can generate a cascade effect at an ecosystemic level. Species that will be displaced. The oxygenation of rivers can be reduced. Well, this has important consequences at the ecosystem level and for the populations of other species. The important thing is to generate an interdisciplinary team in the different entities under the jurisdiction of the territories where the individuals are being displaced, to see what better strategies can be generated, what can be done, what can be managed, because I believe that one of the things they think about is first the sacrifice of the individuals. But I believe that if there is a will, the life of these hippopotamuses can be respected, and surely important strategies for this management will emerge. Foreign species generally bring negative consequences to the interest of the ecosystem. Not everything is true. There are some cases such as bees that due to the pollination process have not presented this negative effect in new ecosystems where they had never been, displacement of other species, but species such as the hippopotamus have been said that they can bring significant problems to rivers, swamps, due to their weight and all the biological dynamics involved. But I think it is important not to wait to see what happens, that is, in their natural ecosystems these phenomena are not seen because these ecosystems and these species have been there for many years. They have adapted to these ecosystems. There has been a natural flow, like this dynamic there, but here hippos have never been, as is the case of the swamps or in the Magdalena Medio, for example, in these ecosystems of this area. So it is important not to wait to see what happens, because if we have seen, as with other species, the problems that invasion can generate, then generally those negative effects, I believe that first we should enter into management. Well, what can we do to manage this species so that it does not become complicated in the future and the individuals can survive over time? Another problem of these populations, for example inside the cities, is that they are very closed populations. They are populations that have inbreeding problems. If we look at them in detail, when many times people feed them, which is something we should not do, we will observe that there are individuals that have some problems, some deformations in their legs, in their beaks, and this is due to the fact that they are populations that have so many crosses within the family. So they are animals that genetically are not very viable, because they are, as we have already said, closed populations. So this is another problem with these species. We know that any species, nature fulfills an ecological function. Let's say that invasive species overflowed that ecological function. Then instead of bringing us benefits they cause us problems. The case for example of pigeons. We could say that their function simply as we conceive it is ornamental. Nothing more. Because they do not really generate benefits for other species. But rather they compete with our native species for resources. The ideal with people and interaction with hippos is ideally not to have direct contact. Not to approach them because it is a species that is dangerous in terms of security. If you do not approach them nothing happens. But if one wants to interact more closely, it is the responsibility of the person. But they should know how the problem is with this species because it is aggressive in a territorial way and can bring complications. Ideally, it is not advisable to feed them. I would say that if they know of the presence of any of these individuals in certain places, it is necessary to communicate them to the corresponding territorial entities to see what can be done or how it can be managed. But ideally not to have a direct contact. Not to feed them, because they are also taking the place and people get used to it and they also get used to this resource that is being provided to them. One of the issues that we have tried to address the most is the species in the city environment as it has had a success and how we have in some points characterized that we have some populations of populations that has been complex to control. Is the case in Moravia we have one. In the Milagrosa, we have another block in the Poblado part, in Belen, in Itagüí. In some of the municipalities we have the species present in many places. In that order of ideas, we think that the strategies is when people take them and see that it is a complicated species, we are doing a bad disposal of it. Because what we do is we put it in the garbage bag, then it is going from one place to another. Some are disposing it, throwing it in the front garden, or where there is a creek they throw it there, and the animal there will find all the right conditions to have that reproductive success. In this order of ideas, we have some techniques precisely for control, and the most technical is to start a freezing process, and then incinerate the animals precisely to be able to block all the reproductive structures and stop all the biological processes of the species. But we know that the citizen as such cannot do that. So there are some homemade measures that are regularly used, and it is first to place them in buckets with salt so that the animal dehydrates, and then bury the animal. Other is to use cal viva, since this substance also dehydrates them. When they dehydrate they die. And then proceed to bury these animals. What is recommended is not to put them in garbage bags or throw them in the trash or the garbage can. But it is better to open a hole in the garden or in the solar part of the houses and bury them to be able to cut and help the city. We must control a little bit the presence of this species in the urban environment. So, as we have been mentioning, the animal represents a zoonotic risk for the human species. So it is very important, in addition to the management measures I mentioned before, to take into account that when handling the animal, it is necessary to use surgical gloves or to pick it up with a bag, to avoid the nematode. If it has it, that is, we are not saying that 100% of the animals have the nematode. There is a great probability that the nematode is present in the slime they shed. So in that order of ideas, be very careful if they are going to handle them without any protection. Then evaluate that they do not have any wounds or small scratches, because that nematode can enter through there, and immediately wash their hands very well with soap and water, precisely to prevent the risk that the nematode enters any human system and can make them sick. Although pigeons were brought for ornamental use, many other people also have them for recreational activities such as pigeon racing, which are carrier pigeons, or there are decorative pigeons of different breeds. Well, that is fine, because in some way they maintain control. Their breeding is controlled, well. But when they get out of control, before bringing benefits they are bringing us inconveniences, because although every species in nature must have an ecological function and promote environmental services, pigeons in our case, no. Apparently we do not see it, because in some way they bring inconveniences. They are competing with our wild species and are causing a number of public health problems as well. One of the difficulties in the management of hippopotamus, I believe, is the will. When there is will, I believe that even mountains move, and one of the problems is that the hippopotamus can reach up to 4 tons. So they are very large individuals, and one would think that they are not agile. But they are very agile and can run a lot. even up to 40 or 50 kilometers per hour, and the difficulty is, well, how do we manage? How can with a pigeon I can handle them. With a pigeon I can manipulate it with my hands. A hippopotamus, how can I manipulate it? But I believe that if you generate or sit down to talk with different areas of knowledge and think about how is the best strategy, the best way to move a hippopotamus, what can we do? What happens is that we have not sat down to think a little about how we can manage the hippos in a better way. So that makes it a little complex in the dynamics of how this species can be managed.